Well, hello, Jason.
Hi.
It's great to finally meet you face to face.
Likewise.
So, Razib put us together to talk about evolutionary psychology and evolutionary anthropology beyond sex.
Right.
So, why don't we start off by you introducing yourself, some of your research interests, and why it is that you chose to get involved in evolutionary studies in the first place?
Sure. So I'm in my fourth year in a developmental psychology PhD program. I actually started out doing something entirely different. I was doing neuroimaging studies of reading and dyslexia, but I've entirely switched gears. And I'm now studying the evolution of the mind, the evolution of cognition, by studying primarily chickens and dogs and humans. And for me, I'm particularly interested in the evolution of social cognition. I think studying animals is fun, also, and I think that there's a lot of important questions that we have to ask about psychology, about the way people interact with each other. That really, taking an evolutionary approach just seems to make no sense to me. And what about you?
Well, I also switched things up fairly dramatically midstream through my program. I started off in evolutionary anthropology. I did my master's degree with a thesis on bonobo cooperation and social behavior. And I was doing my PhD at Duke, working with Brian Hare, among other people. And I caught the history bug. I decided I was more fascinated with the debates that were happening in the 19th century about how evolution could evolve. And so I decided to take it in a more historical, theoretical direction. And so now I'm doing a PhD in the history of science at the University of British Columbia.
It's interesting. What were, if you could sort of, distill it a little bit, what were the major issues in the 19th century regarding, the way people thought about evolution?
Well, of course, Darwin talked about the evolution of cooperation as an important part of natural selection. If you go through the origin of species, he probably gives equal weight to what would be considered pro-social behavior versus inter-individual competition and aggression. However, Darwin never did any public debates or public presentations about his theory. That was all left to his colleagues, especially Thomas Henry Huxley, who emphasized the competitive aspect. He called natural selection a Hobbesian war of all against all, and referred to it as a gladiator show. He focused on the intense competition between individuals, but didn't look at the larger issues of struggle for existence, about individuals working together against harsh conditions. That has just as much potential for leaving your genes into the next generation. Now, of course, they didn't know about genes then, but they understood the issues. One of the key advocates for the evolution of cooperation during this time was a Russian naturalist and political radical named Peter Kropotkin. And the work he did in a book called Mutual Aid directly challenged Huxley's interpretation of natural selection. Now, Kropotkin's view of the time was more or less dismissed by naturalists. One, he came from a different biological tradition. He was originally Russian from birth. He was born a prince before he turned against the Tsar. And so the tradition of Russian biologists wasn't as familiar to the English biologists. So his emphasis wasn't appreciated, and it was thought that he was mixing biology and politics in an unfavorable direction. So at this time, social Darwinism was considered more acceptable than what Kropotkin was talking about of mutual aid.
It's interesting that you mentioned this tension between science and politics, because the little that I know about science and politics in Russia suggests that there was a really strong relationship between well, what some people thought were the facts of evolution, people like Lysenko, and politics, that that there were certain theories that were state doctrine, and that you could be in a lot of trouble for going against that state doctrine.
Yes, of course, Kropotkin was prior to the communist revolution, so he was working under the Tsars, that form of imperialism, and Lysenko enjoyed the privilege of having Stalin's ear, and he was part of that communist imperialism. And you've actually recently written a piece for Scientific American for their the blog network, looking at Balyev, who was a victim of Lysenko in many ways.
Yeah, in some sense. I mean, he was one of the lucky ones who got to live, and kept doing his work. But while he was committed to classical genetics, he sort of developed a front in which he was looking at things like anatomy and behavior, while secretly continuing to think about genetics. And he was also probably relatively protected by the fact that he was out in the middle of Siberia, in a little town just about at the middle of the Trans-Siberian Railroad called Novosibirsk, where he was studying foxes. And this is one of my favorite stories in science, one of my favorite studies. At the time, biologists would look around at domestic dogs, and all the variation that exists in dogs. Think comparing a Great Dane to a tiny little poodle or a chihuahua or something. And you don't see that kind of variation really in gray wolves, which at the time it was assumed that domestic dogs descended from wolves, and this is true. But where did all this variation come from in things like fur coloration and size and behavior? Goliath thought that something was obviously selected for, and he sort of had a hunch that it had something to do with the way these early dogs and these wolves would interact with humans. So he set out. He went and bought a bunch of fur foxes, silver foxes that were originally destined for fur coats, and instituted a very strict selective breeding program where these foxes would be raised with very minimal human contact, and then once they were old enough, a human would approach the cage, and the fox would either sort of avoid the human and back away and maybe hiss and snarl and sort of be very anxious and aggressive. But some of the foxes, a few of the foxes, would sort of be curious about the human. They would approach the human. And only those foxes that didn't display that fearful, aggressive response, the ones who approached, got to breed. And after a handful of generations, what they started to see was essentially domesticated silver foxes. So not only were these foxes friendlier, which makes sense because they were selected on the basis of this behavioral response, but they started to see changes in the morphology and the anatomy and the physiology of these animals. So changes in fur coloration patterns, changes in bone density and skull shape. Their tails got curlier. They developed floppy ears. Something about floppy ears is that the only wild animal that has them is the elephant. Just about any other animal that has floppy ears is domesticated. They lost their sort of musky fox smell. In general, they basically acted like pet dogs. When you approach them, they would wag their tail, they would sniff you, they would lick you. Nothing at all like the aggressive responses that were seen in the first generation.
And all they selected for was friendliness towards humans.
Right. It was purely on the basis of what does the animal do when the human walks up and reaches out his or her hand. So
what we were looking at then is what would be called today a selective sweep, where
absolutely.
you choose one trait and a host of other traits come along with it.
Right. So by selecting for tameness or against fear and aggression, all these other things that now we understand the way gene interactions work and things like that. But at the time, this was a relatively brand new science, and these findings that you could, on the basis of behavior, elicit all of these other changes it's a big deal. I think it's fascinating.
No, it is really fascinating, and it ties in very closely with what primatologists like Richard Wrangham and his former student at Harvard, Brian Hare, have been talking about recently with self-domestication, as they call it, in bonobos.
Exactly.
Because as many people, I'm sure, know, bonobos and chimpanzees have very different behaviors. I'm sure you know this, but maybe some of the viewers don't. When chimpanzees get together, they'll form all male bands that will patrol the borders of their territory. And if they encounter a rival group, they will interpret the calls that they hear. And if they think that they outnumber those individuals, they'll attack and sometimes kill the males from this other group. This is something that is never seen in bonobos. In the field, when two different bonobo groups interact in the forest, there's a lot of screaming, there's a lot of tension, but they've been observed to groom the other individuals and even have sex, which is something, of course, chimpanzees would never do. We've never seen male-male sexual behavior between chimpanzees. And there's this question of what selective pressures could have resulted in these very different behaviors between chimpanzees and bonobos. They had a common ancestor roughly 1 million years ago. And one hypothesis that has been gaining a lot of traction is that in the bonobo habitat in the Democratic Republic of Congo, there are many more food resources, and there is less competition with other species. In many of the chimpanzee habitats, they're also competing with gorillas. And so, in a sense, because of these abundant food resources in the bonobo habitat, there was a selection away from aggressive behavior. And in that sense, there was a selective sweep of behaviors that went along with them. So, for example, bonobos are more juvenile in their appearance. They have a delayed social behavior and cognition compared to chimpanzees. They are more gracile. They're more slender than chimpanzees are. So a host of behaviors that fit in very closely, it seems, with what you're talking about from Baleyev's research.
Absolutely. I think that looking at the transition of the wild silver foxes to the domesticated foxes and extrapolating to the transition between wolves and domestic dogs, you see a lot of these same things repeated over and over again when you, for example, compare chimpanzees and bonobos. And this idea of that bonobos are sort of have delayed development, or they're sort of eternally juvenile, is I think really interesting, especially because in some of these tests, in some of these experiments, juvenile chimpanzees in many ways look a lot like adult bonobos. Or if you think about it backwards, that adult bonobos are displaying behaviors that you would expect for a young chimpanzee, but not for a mature chimpanzee. And if we want to push the speculation out even a little bit farther, it may even be the case for humans, for us, that in some sense we've sort of self-domesticated. There are a lot of things about humans that we sort of retain from childhood that were, we had these juvenile features.
Mm-hmm. And that's been around for a good 20 years, I think, talking about human evolution as retaining what is referred to as neotenous features.
Right.
So we have a less pronounced snout compared to earlier hominid species. We, in many ways, are more similar to bonobos than we are to chimpanzees.
In some ways, I think there's probably echoes of chimpanzee in human culture and echoes of bonobo in human culture.
Absolutely.
But that's one of the great things with having multiple model species for different phenomena and different problems. there are different species we can go and ask questions about. Some things it makes a lot of sense to study chimpanzees, and some things it makes a lot of sense to study bonobos. And sometimes the best species for a problem is dogs, or even chickens. But this, I want to come back to this question of stress, which we brought up at the beginning. That one of the main features that determined whether or not in the fox breeding program, one of the features that determined whether or not a fox got to breed was how stressed out it was upon the approach of the human, and if it was highly stressed, it would be more aggressive. And we see this parallel, like you said, with in terms of competition for food among chimpanzees and bonobos. If you're in a situation where a low stress environment, it makes sense that over time the tendency to be more aggressive when foraging would be selected against. And the reason I bring that up again is because you recently wrote some stuff about stress and motherhood and stuff like that. Is that right?
Yeah, there's been some fascinating research done by University of Chicago psychologist Dario Mastropieri. He's been working on this theory for about 20 years, doing tests with female macaques at the University of Chicago. And what he has been looking at is the way that mothers react to stress. So in his latest review paper that I wrote about for Scientific American's blog network, he talks about how there's a heightened stress response when females become pregnant and then throughout the period of nursing. And he argues that this stress response is adaptive, that it serves as a kind of early warning signal for mothers as a way to protect their offspring when they're most vulnerable during this first year before the weaning process. Yet, what was particularly remarkable is there was a heightened stress response not only with mothers, but with low-status mothers. So on the island of Cayo Santiago, they looked at 70 females that were experienced mothers and that were pregnant and had young offspring. And they tracked the status of these mothers based on who was displacing whom and where they ranked in the local pecking order. And then they measured their cortisol responses. And the low-status mothers had significantly higher cortisol than any other group, suggesting that these mothers were highly, highly stressed. And this actually bared out to have some, some basis when they looked at the data on infant deaths throughout the last 10 years. The infants of low-status mothers were significantly more likely to die in the first year than any other status. So these mothers were generally freaked out because their infants were constantly a threat, but because they were low status, they were unable to do anything about it.
Is the increase in infant deaths, could that be attributable to something like less access to resources, less food, things like that, or is there a? I guess my question is: did they establish a causal relationship between the stress response and these outcomes, or at this point are these things all basically intertwined?
Well, at the Cayo Santiago study, they didn't talk about the cause of the deaths. What they were looking at primarily was the increased cortisol levels of these low-status mothers, and finding that there was some basis for this. It could have been because of their concern about their infants. In previous studies, they've shown a direct correlation between high cortisol levels in the mother and increases in abusive behaviors and maternal infanticide.
And does this translate to humans?
Absolutely. It's remarkable how closely this translates. Not only does it translate to humans, but it is far and away unlike anything seen in the natural world. Robert Sapolsky has written about this in his great book, Why Zebras Don't Get Ulcers. And the stress from inequality is extremely heightened in our species, much more so than any other species. And in the case of maternal infanticide, there have been a number of studies. In the article, I wrote about 3 different studies that looked at both the United States and around the world, finding that inequality was the highest risk factor for maternal infanticide.
That's interesting. So this is one of the reasons why I think this is really important. It's obviously important research with important implications, but it's a really good example of taking an evolutionary approach to a problem, other than sex and gender-related issues and war and aggression.
Mm-hmm.
We sort of mentioned at the very beginning of our conversation that part of the impetus for us doing this was to get beyond sex and war when thinking about evolutionary psychology and things like that. What's your perspective on that? Why do you think evolutionary psychology sort of has such a bad reputation when some of this work is really, really important, deserves to be spread widely?
Well, I think one problem may be that because stories about sex are so appealing for readers, they get a lot of media attention, but the studies themselves may not be as strong as they could be. So I recall one study that was looking at 12 lap dancers and the amount of tips they got, and extrapolating from this very tiny sample size to the human species. That is just one example of how it got a lot of media attention, but the study itself didn't tell us a whole lot.
We even saw this week there was a new finding, a study of I think 51 undergrads, and they tracked their cell phone usage and how often they called home and how long the conversations were, and the main finding was that during periods of ovulation, these young women were calling their fathers less, or when they did call, the conversations were shorter. And the interpretation is that it's sort of part of an incest avoidance mechanism. And I think there are a few decent things about the way the experiment is set up and explained, but it's still, it's 51 undergrads. It's tracking when they're calling home. It doesn't necessarily track when home calls them. But it's been getting a ton of press.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I bemoaned this in an article I wrote for PLOS Blogs about a month ago, and it was Joe Henrich. He's a psychologist, evolutionary psychologist at the University of British Columbia, where I'm at, and showed that over 70% of all studies in psychology, not just evolutionary psychology, but the entire field, are done using American undergrads. They've become the model for humans. And he goes through many different categories to show how this is the most unrepresentative sample you could ever choose for the human population.
So, I agree. This is a general problem in the field of studying human behavior. What do you think? Is there a solution?
Well, one potential solution, at least something I think that would help undermine some of the criticisms, is to diversify the sample size. So, merging with anthropology in many ways, and doing some of these same cognitive tests around the world. Different socioeconomic statuses, different lifestyles, hunter-gatherers, agrarian farmers, to get around the influence of environment and culture.
I agree. I think more cross-cultural studies, more cross-sectional, longitudinal studies. So we're not just looking at college students, people 18 to 24, 26. I think all of that is important. But I also think that studying humans is tricky. And to some extent, studying animals, in some ways, can be a little bit more simple and will be a little bit. You can have a little bit more control over certain things.
Absolutely.
And I think animals are the way to study people. You just have to ask the right questions of the right animals.
Well, you've written something quite interesting recently, looking at dolphins and a different way of looking at cooperation.
So just a brief sort of recap of this new interesting study. We know that dolphins are highly social creatures, and it's not that surprising that they have a sort of highly organized social structure, especially given the fact that they are right up there with humans and chimpanzees and bonobos in terms of the extent to which their brains are encephalized. There's a high correlation between the way that the brain is encephalized and social cognition and social structure. And it's not an accident that we use the same term to describe dolphin structure, fission-fusion, that we describe chimpanzee social hierarchy. So the basic idea is that there are these small groups of 3 to 4 individual, and we're talking about the males right now, 3 to 4 individuals who tend to hang out together, help each other find mates. But these individuals are related. So when we seek cooperation between these kinds of individuals, it can be explained on the basis of something like kin selection. And then we have this sort of second level hierarchy, these second order alliances, which we also see in chimpanzees and to some extent in humans, of groups of first order alliances working cooperatively. Usually, again, when it comes to finding mates, these things don't only apply to foraging situations. But again, most of these individuals are related. So when there's cooperation, it can be generally explained away by kin selection. What's really interesting, the new finding, is that they found a third level of social hierarchy, what they call second-order super alliances, or third-level alliances, where now you've got groups of first and second-order alliances that are cooperating, but these individuals are not related, and these relationships. The way the teams are organized differ based on who's around. So if I see enemy number 1, I might recruit friend number 1 to help me. But if enemy number 3 is approaching, it may actually be the case that enemy number 1 and I are going to work together. So there's this really complicated arrangement where not only do these dolphins need to know who their friends and enemies are, but they also need to know how all the other groups and how all the other individuals think of them. So if it sounds like it's really complicated, it's because it is. And what's really interesting about this is that this maps on really nicely onto the human friendship literature, the peer relationship literature. Because human friendships, the basis on which cooperation builds, can't really be explained by kin selection, because generally we're not friends with our relatives. When we talk about friendships and peer relationships, these aren't usually our relatives. And historically, social psychologists who have studied these sorts of things have relied on explanations like similarity. So kids and people who are similar maybe will decide to be friends. I like science, you like science, let's be friends, we have something in common. But this doesn't really capture the nuance of human friendships. And some social psychologists have relied on something called propinquity, which is basically people who are geographically near each other will tend to hang out together. But that doesn't quite capture the complexity either. So I think, and I think there are some other people who think so too. Like Robert Kurzban just wrote up something in his blog. His post was actually the one that inspired mine. That these the way we think about friendships in the context of social psychology could learn a thing or two from these dolphin studies.
Yeah, and is it different from what Robert Trivers proposed in the 1970s with reciprocal altruism?
Not. I mean, I think it's still probably a bit of an open question. There's one study. It's really hard to study dolphins. Obviously, they're in the water and we're not. I think reciprocal altruism probably can explain some of it, but I still think this phenomenon where in one situation you're allied with another individual or another group, but then in a different situation you're allied with other people. You might be allied with former enemies, depending on who your new rival is. This is if reciprocal altruism explained everything, then you would sort of have this back and forth tit for tat, you help me, I'll help you situation. But what you have instead is in situation A, we're enemies, but then later we might be friends because we share an enemy. And that's, I think, a little bit more complicated than what reciprocal altruism would allow.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's very interesting. There was another study a couple years ago that is also challenges the usual framework of kin selection and reciprocal altruism, which until probably fairly recently dominated the explanation. All the explanations for cooperation were either kin selection or reciprocal altruism. So you're looking at this sort of nuanced version. This other study from 2007 by Jack Panksepp was looking at rats, who we don't, I imagine, think about when talking about altruism. And what this study found was that those rats that helped another rat that they didn't know, had never interacted with before, and that they were totally unrelated to, that when they helped this other rat access food by pulling a lever for them, the rat that received the food was more likely to offer anonymous help to another rat. So it was a very similar phenomenon to the film Pay It Forward, in which there was this almost general template that if you receive anonymous help, it's in your interest to offer anonymous help yourself. Perhaps because it's a kin member that's helping you and that you would be helping a kin member yourself, or that it could fit in with this reciprocal altruism equation that you'll be more likely to encounter these individuals in your group again, and by helping others, they will help you in turn. But so what we're looking at is that could be a much more general approach to understanding cooperation.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, some of these findings could potentially just be explained by the fact that, like, as humans, the cultures that we live in, the kinds of groups that we interact with are so different from the way we lived. When presumably these things were being selected, that it just might sort of be a byproduct of evolutionary accidents. Mm-hmm. That under normal circumstances, if you tend to always hang out with the same people and you live in these small communities, then a rule that went like, if I get help, I should pay it forward, makes sense. Even from a kin selection perspective, because the people that you tend to be around will tend to share some of your genes. Mm-hmm. Right. But something that I've been thinking about a little bit lately, and I just wrote a post about this, is gratitude, which may for at least for some kinds of interactions and for some species may explain, I think, some of this kind of cooperation, which you might not expect if you were solely concerned with things like kin selection.
Well, what was happening with gratitude? It was on chimpanzees, if I remember correctly.
Right. So again, you see these interactions between individuals, a lot of times when thinking about gratitude, people bring up vampire bats. And vampire bats, as the name suggests, only feed on blood, and they need to eat something like once every 7 or 10 days in order to survive. No, I'm sorry, they need to eat once every 3 days in order to survive. But adult vampire bats regularly, once every 7 to 10 days, miss a meal. And so what happens? Other bats who had fed that day will regurgitate blood into the mouths of the hungry individuals. And it doesn't always. It's not always the case that if yesterday you vomited blood into my mouth, today I'll vomit blood into your mouth. That kind of one-to-one, tit-for-tat model can't always explain this phenomenon. So it seems to be a good model for perhaps this kind of pay-forward or gratitude thing. But it turns out that vampire bats tend to be related to each other in these groups. But what happened with chimpanzees? It was initially thought that this same sort of method applied to chimpanzees, that people just tended to help out other people. Individual chimpanzees tended to help each other out, and it didn't necessarily matter if they tracked who did what for who, because in general, if you help people who are near you, you'll be helping your kids. But what they did was, it turned out they would track who in the morning, which individuals were grooming each other, who was grooming partners, and then in the afternoon they would give leaves and food to the chimpanzees, and they would track who shared food with whom. And it turned out that food was shared between grooming partners. So if you groomed me in the morning, then in the afternoon, if I had food, I would give you some. But it actually wasn't the case that if you groomed me in the morning, you would give me food later. Turns out that chimpanzees actually keep track of these things, sort of in whose court is the ball. So this morning I did something nice for you, now it's your turn to do something nice for me. And some supporting evidence for that kind of mental calculation comes from the fact that there's sort of defector punishment mechanism in place. So if you don't do what is expected, then you can be punished. Maybe next time you won't get groomed, or I won't share my food with you, or whatever. And that also maps on somewhat well, I think, onto human culture, like with gift giving. We don't necessarily think that we keep score in that way, especially when it comes to our close friends. And maybe it's simply not accessible to our consciousness, or we don't have that kind of insight. But the evidence suggests that there is this kind of scorekeeping among humans.
The literature in anthropology and throughout history are that grudges can be major factors in conflicts. So people certainly do remember when slights took place.
Absolutely, people totally track these things. What I'm saying is that it doesn't. I'm not aware of that I'm keeping score, perhaps until there is a violation, and then it becomes clear.
Yeah, it's almost as if there's just a general sense of fairness,
right?
That when it's violated, but you may not necessarily be keeping track of it play by play. It reminds me of a study that was done by Franz de Waal just last year, and they were following up on an earlier study they did with capuchin monkeys, in which they gave these capuchin monkeys a high-valued food item versus a low-valued food item. And when a capuchin monkey got a low-value food item, they protested. They refused to eat it. They threw it back at the researcher. So they did the same study with chimpanzees, and they brought the two chimpanzees into the testing area. They sometimes gave them the same high-value food item, so sometimes gave them the same low-value food item, and sometimes gave them unequal food items. And what was particularly interesting was, yes, the individuals that received a low-value food item would often refuse to eat it, were significantly more likely to refuse to eat it. But so was the individual that received the high-value food item. This was not something that was seen in the capuchin monkeys. Even a high-ranking male that received a high-value food item was more likely to not eat it if the other individual in the test received a low-value food item. So there was a general sense of fairness that was, if not understood, at least the behaviors suggest that there was an understanding of it.
It's funny that you mentioned that, because that's also that phenomenon, that sort of sense of equality is also seen in dogs. There's a study, I think from Adam McCloskey's lab. He's in Hungary. One of the first labs in the world that was dedicated to studying the human-dog interaction, the human-dog relationship. And they set up a paradigm where you'd have two dogs in a room together, and you would reward them both with some kind of a food reward for a behavior. But then if you stopped rewarding one of the dogs for the behavior and continued requesting it, the other dog would stop eliciting the behavior, even though he was or she was going to continue receiving the food rewards. So that there is this sense of equality is probably more pervasive than we really know about, and probably a little more widespread.
Yeah, I think so. And as we move forward, I always find it interesting how, when you look at the sociology of science, different trends in science emerge at different periods in history. And right now, cooperation is one of the most fascinating topics. It's a topic that gets many of the headlines in both anthropology and psychology and biology. And many researchers are looking at this. I find it interesting that as we are trying to deal with creating a sustainable society today and trying to find a way for upwards of 10 billion people by 2050 all cooperating with each other, potentially scientists are trying to figure out how it can be done.
Right, so this sort of brings us back to some of the things we were talking about at the beginning of our talk in terms of stress and the stress response and aggression. And I think as people start to live sort of closer together, and we sort of have to share resources and share space, it's probably getting a little bit speculative, but I can imagine a sort of selection against fear and aggression of strangers and of other individuals, and hopefully a selection for tameness, essentially for domestication.
Sort of a continuation of the self-domestication process.
Right. I mean, I would certainly hope that we'll continue domesticating in some sense.
Well, if you consider the example of Monkey Hill in the 1920s, it's a classic example of the importance of field research. What happened was there was this primatologist, Sally Zuckerberg, who was an anatomist, knew very little about primate behavior. He threw all these baboons together into a facility at the London Zoo, multiple males, multiple females, and over a period of years chronicled their behavior. And it was absolutely brutal. There was probably about 70 deaths during a 5-year period as the males would attack each other.
And baboons are particularly vicious among non-human primates, right?
They are, but nothing like that has ever been seen in the wild since. It was later found that it was the unnatural conditions of this zoo environment and not understanding their social structure that is what was causing the violence. So you can have baboons in an area even smaller than they were in the zoo, but because there is an implicit understanding of baboon social rules, there weren't conflicts. So baboons live in a single male, multi-female society. So one male will be with about 4 or 5, sometimes upwards to 8 females. And if a male is injured, other males will try and compete with each other to impress the females and have them in their group. So at the London Zoo, the ratio of males to females was completely out of whack. And so males would compete with each other one would get injured or killed, and there'd be a scramble anew to try and establish these baboon groups. And as we look towards the human future, I often wonder if the violence that is often seen within societies that are not well suited to the human species, what Desmond Morris referred to as the human zoo, how we are going to adapt, if we are going to change the society to be more in line with human innate social needs, or if there will be a domestication process and will adapt to zoo conditions.
Yeah, I mean, I sort of imagine that a little bit of both will probably happen, and sort of have to think about short term versus long term. The long term, I if I'm placing bets, I would bet that some sort of domestication process or something that's analogous to that process would take place, or at least I hope that's what would happen. But in the short term, I think knowing these things, having the example for baboons, and the distressed rhesus mothers, and all these kinds of things, understanding the way that stress impacts not just on behavior, but on health and anatomy and physiology and things like that. Hopefully, we can begin to implement some positive changes based on that research and that understanding. In a non-evolutionary time frame, much quicker.
It's one of the most fascinating applications of evolutionary biology today is to try and figure out who we are as a species and how we can best organize ourselves in a way that suits our innate needs.
Absolutely. Well, this has been a great talk. I think we're coming up on our time limit.
Well, it was an absolute pleasure to talk with you today, and I really look forward to interacting with you in the future. I know we'll be talking together at the Science Online conference in January.
Yes, we will. We'll be talking about blogging as a method of communicating versus blogging as a mechanism for learning about science, which I think will be really interesting.
All right, great. I'll see you in the comments.
All right.
On the blog. See you later.